The most dangerous people in the world are not the obviously cruel, the overtly aggressive, or the visibly ruthless. The most dangerous people are those who approach you with gentle smiles, soft voices, and apparent concern for your well-being, while possessing the iron will and strategic intelligence to destroy you the moment your usefulness expires. They wear compassion like armor, wielding kindness like a weapon, using your trust as the rope with which to bind you. Tonight, we tear away the beautiful mask to reveal the calculating face beneath it. Compassion is not virtue, it is strategy. Power is not cruelty, it is the reality hiding behind the performance of care. In the grand theater of human manipulation, no performance is more convincing than genuine compassion deployed by those who possess genuine power. This is not the empty compassion of the powerless, their desperate attempts to earn love through servitude, to gain approval through submission, to find meaning through self-sacrifice. This is strategic compassion, the deliberate cultivation of emotional connection, trust, and psychological dependency by those sophisticated enough to understand that the greatest control is exercised not through force, but through making others want to be controlled. Tonight, we descend into the philosophical depths where comfortable illusions about human goodness collide with uncomfortable truths about human nature. We will explore how the most effective manipulators are those who genuinely care about their victims, because caring allows them to predict behavior, exploit vulnerabilities, and maintain long-term influence that crude domination could never achieve. We will examine why compassion without power is victimhood waiting to happen, why power without compassion is tyranny destined to fail, and why the fusion of both creates the most sophisticated and dangerous form of human influence ever developed. Through the surgical political analysis of Niccolò Machiavelli, who understood that princes who master the art of appearing virtuous while possessing the strength to be ruthless achieve dominance without resistance, through the shadow psychology of Carl Jung, who revealed that integrated power requires owning both the capacity for creation and destruction, for healing and harming, for protecting and predating, through the beyond good and evil philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, who recognized that authentic strength transcends the false choice between compassion and power by mastering both, through the strategic insights of Sun Tzu, who knew that the supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting by making conquest appear as liberation, and through the modern understanding of psychological manipulation that reveals how empathy becomes the most powerful tool for control when wielded by those who understand its mechanisms, we will uncover why compassion is the mask that power wears to hide its true face from those too weak to bear, looking at it directly. By the end of this philosophical revelation, you will understand why the kindest people are often the most dangerous, why those who claim to help you often control you most completely, and why learning to wear the mask of compassion while maintaining the face of power beneath it is not moral corruption, but sophisticated adaptation to a world where influence flows to those intelligent enough to conceal their strength behind apparent weakness. The question that will determine whether you remain vulnerable to compassionate manipulation or become capable of compassionate control is this: will you continue to believe that compassion and power are opposites, or will you learn to integrate both as the complementary tools they actually are? Niccolò Machiavelli understood something that escapes most people. The prince who appears virtuous while possessing the capability for strategic ruthlessness achieves more lasting dominance than the prince who relies on either virtue alone or force alone. His analysis reveals that compassion, when deployed by those who possess real power, becomes the most effective method for achieving and maintaining control because it eliminates resistance by making subjugation appear as care. Machiavelli observed that people will resist obvious attempts at domination, but will enthusiastically cooperate with their own enslavement when that enslavement is presented as concern for their well-being, protection from harm, or assistance with their problems. The sophisticated ruler learns to frame every exercise of power as an act of compassion, every limitation of others' freedom as protection from their own poor judgment, every expansion of control as service to those being controlled. This strategic use of compassion operates by exploiting the fundamental human need to believe that those who have power over us actually care about our welfare, rather than simply using us for their own purposes. People cannot psychologically tolerate the reality that they are being controlled by those who see them merely as resources to be managed, so they cooperate enthusiastically with rulers who present themselves as compassionate guardians rather than as strategic manipulators. The Machiavellian insight reveals that genuine compassion, the actual emotional experience of caring about others' welfare, can be more dangerous than artificial compassion because it allows the compassionate manipulator to predict their victim's behavior more accurately, to exploit their vulnerabilities more completely, and to maintain their loyalty more permanently than any crude domination strategy could achieve. Consider how this operates in practice. The manager who genuinely cares about employees' well-being can extract longer hours, greater loyalty, and more complete compliance than the manager who relies on threats alone, because the caring manager understands exactly which emotional buttons to push to make exploitation feel like opportunity, overwork feel like investment in career development, and submission feel like team cooperation. The compassionate manipulator studies their targets carefully, learns their fears and desires intimately, and then presents every demand as serving the target's own interests rather than the manipulator's objectives. This approach is more effective than crude domination because it eliminates psychological resistance by making victims complicit in their own control. Machiavelli understood that this strategic deployment of compassion requires genuine power as its foundation, because without the ability to enforce consequences, compassion becomes mere pleading that others can ignore whenever cooperation becomes inconvenient for them. The compassionate person who lacks power cannot protect those they care about, cannot enforce the standards they proclaim, and cannot prevent their compassion from being exploited by those who understand their weakness. The truly dangerous individual, from Machiavelli's perspective, is the one who combines genuine care for others' welfare with ruthless determination to control the conditions under which that welfare is maintained. They create environments where others prosper, but only within boundaries established and maintained through power that remains largely invisible because it is exercised through compassionate control rather than obvious domination. This approach to power creates what Machiavelli would recognize as voluntary servitude, a condition where those being controlled actively support their controllers because they have been convinced that their interests and their controllers' interests are identical. The mask of compassion makes this identification possible by concealing the underlying power dynamic beneath apparent mutual care. The Machiavellian principle reveals that mastering the relationship between compassion and power requires understanding when to emphasize each element, appearing compassionate when establishing relationships and gaining trust, demonstrating power when boundaries are tested or authority is challenged, returning to compassionate presentation once dominance has been established and accepted. This cyclical approach, compassion to gain access, power to establish dominance, compassion to maintain loyalty, creates sustainable control that appears voluntary to those being controlled, while serving the strategic objectives of those exercising control. The mask never slips completely, but the face beneath occasionally shows through just enough to remind others that the compassion they receive is conditional on their continued cooperation. Carl Jung's exploration of the shadow reveals the psychological mechanisms through which the integration of compassion and power creates the most complete and dangerous form of human development. Individuals who have embraced both their capacity for creation and destruction, for healing and harming, for nurturing and dominating, without allowing moral categories to fragment their effectiveness. Jung understood that most people cannot psychologically tolerate acknowledging their own capacity for manipulation, exploitation, and strategic cruelty because they need to maintain self-images based on being good, kind, and harmless. This psychological limitation creates what he called shadow projection, where they see manipulative behavior only in others while remaining unconscious of their own manipulative patterns. The person who has integrated their shadow, in contrast, owns their capacity for compassionate manipulation while choosing when and how to exercise it, based on strategic considerations rather than moral constraints or unconscious compulsions. They can be genuinely caring when caring serves their objectives, and strategically ruthless when ruthlessness is required, without experiencing internal conflict about the apparent contradiction. Jung observed that this integration creates individuals who are far more dangerous than either purely compassionate people or purely power-driven people, because they can shift seamlessly between modes of interaction while maintaining psychological coherence and strategic focus. They are not limited by moral categories that constrain less integrated individuals from accessing the full spectrum of human capabilities. The shadow-integrated person understands that their capacity for manipulation is not a moral failing to be suppressed, but a psychological capability to be understood and deployed strategically. They recognize that their ability to exploit others' vulnerabilities can serve constructive purposes when used to protect those they value, advance objectives they believe are worthy, or create conditions they prefer to alternatives that might emerge if they remained psychologically disarmed. Jung's analysis reveals that the most effective compassionate manipulators are often those who genuinely care about their targets, while simultaneously recognizing that caring about someone sometimes requires controlling them in ways they would resist if they understood what was happening. The parent who manipulates their child's behavior through strategic deployment of approval and disappointment, the therapist who shapes their client's development through carefully managed emotional interactions, the leader who influences followers through calculated displays of vulnerability and strength, all of these represent shadow-integrated approaches to compassionate control. The psychological insight that Jung provides is that attempting to maintain compassion without integrating power creates internal fragmentation that makes authentic compassion impossible, while attempting to exercise power without compassionate understanding creates external resistance that makes sustainable control impossible. Only the integration of both elements creates the psychological wholeness that enables sophisticated influence. This integration process requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposing psychological elements in dynamic tension rather than resolving them through the elimination of one element or the other. The shadow-integrated person does not choose between compassion and power, but learns to deploy both according to circumstances and objectives. Jung understood that this integration is particularly challenging for individuals who have been socialized to believe that compassion and power are morally incompatible, that caring about others requires surrendering the ability to control them, that genuine goodness precludes strategic manipulation. These individuals must undergo a psychological transformation that allows them to maintain compassionate feelings while developing manipulative capabilities. The person who completes this transformation discovers that their compassion becomes more effective because it is backed by power, while their power becomes more sustainable because it is guided by compassionate understanding. They learn to care about others in ways that serve both others' welfare and their own strategic objectives, creating win-win relationships that serve everyone involved while maintaining clear hierarchies of influence and control. From Jung's perspective, the mask of compassion and the face of power beneath it represent not deception but psychological integration, the authentic expression of a complete human being who has embraced the full spectrum of human capabilities rather than limiting themselves to socially acceptable aspects of human nature. Friedrich Nietzsche approached the relationship between compassion and power through his critique of traditional moral categories, revealing that the supposed opposition between caring and controlling represents slave morality's attempt to make weakness appear virtuous while making strength appear corrupt. His analysis shows that authentic strength requires transcending this false opposition by mastering both compassion and power as complementary expressions of the will to power. Nietzsche understood that genuine compassion requires power, because without power, compassion becomes mere sentiment that cannot protect what it claims to value, cannot improve what it claims to care about, and cannot prevent the suffering it claims to oppose. The powerless, compassionate person can feel sorry for victims, but cannot help them, can recognize injustice but cannot correct it, can identify problems but cannot solve them. From the Nietzschean perspective, compassion without power is actually a form of moral masturbation, self-indulgent emotional experience that makes the compassionate person feel good about themselves while accomplishing nothing constructive, for those who supposedly benefit from their concern. It represents the psychological comfort of caring without the responsibility of effective action. Power without compassion, in contrast, becomes what Nietzsche would recognize as mere domination, the crude exercise of force without understanding, without strategic intelligence, and without the sophisticated psychological insight that makes control sustainable over time. The purely power-driven individual can compel compliance but cannot inspire loyalty, can create fear but cannot generate genuine cooperation, can dominate bodies but cannot influence minds. Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch represents the integration of compassion and power into what he called noble selfishness, the understanding that serving your own interests optimally requires understanding and serving others' interests strategically, that protecting what you value requires developing the power to protect it, that caring about outcomes requires accepting responsibility for creating them. The Übermensch does not experience conflict between compassion and power because they understand that both are expressions of the same fundamental drive, the will to create conditions that enhance life, beauty, and excellence rather than accepting conditions that diminish them. Their compassion motivates their pursuit of power, while their power enables the effective expression of their compassion. This integration creates what Nietzsche would recognize as beyond good and evil morality, a value system that judges actions by their life-enhancing versus life-diminishing effects, rather than by their conformity to moral categories inherited from slave morality. The integrated individual can be compassionate when compassion serves life and ruthless when ruthlessness serves life, without experiencing guilt about apparent inconsistency. Nietzsche observed that this moral sophistication is threatening to those who remain trapped in conventional moral categories because it demonstrates that moral rules are human creations that can be transcended by those strong enough to create their own values. The person who masters both compassion and power reveals that moral limitations are chosen rather than inevitable, that ethical constraints are voluntary rather than absolute. The Nietzschean path requires what he called self-overcoming, the continuous process of transcending current limitations by developing greater capabilities, accepting greater responsibilities, and creating higher standards. This process necessarily involves integrating compassion and power, because self-overcoming requires both the motivational force that comes from caring about outcomes and the practical capabilities that come from developing power. The person who follows this path learns to use compassion as motivation for power development and power as the means for compassionate effectiveness. They care deeply about creating excellent conditions and develop ruthlessly effective methods for creating them. Their mask of compassion and face of power become unified expressions of their commitment to life enhancement rather than contradictory impulses requiring psychological compartmentalization. From Nietzsche's perspective, the integration of compassion and power is not moral compromise, but moral evolution, the movement from primitive moral categories that limit human development to sophisticated value creation that maximizes human potential. The person who achieves this integration becomes capable of both greater kindness and greater strength than those who remain limited by false moral oppositions. The practical applications of understanding compassion as mask and power as face extend into every domain where influence, relationship management, and outcome control are necessary for achieving objectives that matter to you. This understanding eliminates the waste of energy that comes from believing you must choose between caring about others and controlling circumstances. In professional environments, the person who masters compassionate control learns to frame every exercise of authority as service to their team's development, every demand for performance as opportunity for growth, every enforcement of standards as protection from mediocrity that would ultimately harm everyone involved. This approach generates more willing compliance than either pure compassion or pure authority, because it eliminates psychological resistance by making control appear as care. The compassionate leader studies their team members' individual motivations, fears, and aspirations, then presents every directive in terms that connect with these personal concerns. They don't simply order compliance, they help team members understand how compliance serves their own interests while advancing the leader's objectives. This approach creates enthusiastic cooperation rather than grudging obedience. In personal relationships, mastering the compassion-power dynamic means learning to influence others' behavior through understanding their psychology rather than through emotional manipulation or crude domination. The compassionate controller creates environments where others choose the behaviors that serve mutual benefit, while maintaining clear hierarchies of influence and decision-making authority. This might involve helping a partner understand how certain behaviors affect relationship harmony, while making it clear that continued problematic behavior will result in withdrawal of relationship benefits. The compassionate approach means genuinely caring about the partner's well-being, while the power element means accepting responsibility for creating relationship conditions that serve both parties' long-term interests. In social contexts, the integration of compassion and power enables sophisticated influence that appears as helpful guidance while actually shaping group dynamics, conversation topics, and social hierarchies according to your preferences. The socially integrated individual can redirect conversations, influence group decisions, and shape social dynamics while appearing to serve the group's interests rather than their own agenda. This social influence operates through strategic deployment of attention, validation, and emotional support that rewards behaviors you want to see more of while subtly discouraging behaviors that don't serve your objectives. The group benefits from your influence while you achieve the social outcomes you prefer. A win-win dynamic that maintains itself because everyone involved experiences benefit. The development of compassionate control requires what could be called empathetic intelligence, the ability to understand others' psychological states, motivational structures, and behavioral patterns well enough to predict their responses to different approaches and to design interactions that generate desired outcomes while serving their perceived interests. This intelligence involves studying human psychology, not as abstract theory, but as practical toolkit for understanding how people actually make decisions, what fears and desires drive their behavior, and how different presentations of the same information generate different emotional and behavioral responses. Building empathetic intelligence also requires developing strategic patience, the ability to invest time in understanding others' psychology, building emotional connections, and establishing trust that can later be leveraged for influence. The compassionate controller thinks in terms of long-term relationship development rather than short-term transaction completion. Perhaps most importantly, mastering compassionate control requires accepting responsibility for the welfare of those you influence while maintaining commitment to your own strategic objectives. This means genuinely caring about others' well-being while recognizing that you are often better positioned than they are to understand what actually serves their long-term interests. This responsibility creates ethical complexity because it requires making decisions about others' lives based on your understanding rather than their preferences, but it also creates more sustainable and mutually beneficial relationships than either pure selfishness or pure selflessness could achieve. The ultimate recognition is that compassion and power are not opposites, but complementary aspects of sophisticated human interaction that enable the creation of relationships and environments that serve everyone involved, while maintaining clear hierarchies of influence and control. The person who masters both learns to care genuinely while controlling strategically, to serve others' interests while advancing their own objectives, to appear vulnerable while remaining invulnerable. They discover that the most effective way to get what you want is often to help others get what they want within frameworks that you design and control. This mastery requires abandoning simplistic moral categories that treat compassion and power as mutually exclusive, accepting that influence and care can coexist, and developing the psychological sophistication to deploy both according to circumstances and objectives, rather than according to inherited moral rules that may not serve your actual values or desired outcomes. The choice that determines whether you remain vulnerable to compassionate manipulation or become capable of compassionate control is ultimately about integration versus fragmentation. Will you continue to compartmentalize compassion and power as opposing forces, or will you learn to integrate both as expressions of your commitment to creating excellent conditions for yourself and others? The world is full of people wearing masks of compassion while exercising faces of power beneath them. The question is whether you will recognize these dynamics, protect yourself from exploitation by compassionate manipulators, and learn to deploy both compassion and power strategically in service of objectives that enhance, rather than diminish life. Compassion without power is victimhood waiting to happen. Power without compassion is tyranny destined to fail. The integration of both creates sophisticated influence that serves everyone involved, while ensuring that you remain in control of the conditions under which you provide benefit to others. Stop choosing between caring and controlling. Start integrating both as complementary tools for creating the relationships and environments you prefer. Learn to wear the mask of compassion skillfully while maintaining the face of power beneath it steadily. Master both. Deploy both. Use both to create conditions that serve life, enhance excellence, and advance the objectives that matter most to you. The world belongs to those sophisticated enough to integrate apparent opposites into seamless expressions of strategic intelligence, guided by compassionate understanding. Your compassion is your mask, your power is your face. Learn to wear both with skill, deploy both with wisdom, and integrate both in service of outcomes that justify the sophistication required to achieve them. The choice is yours. Remain limited by false moral categories or transcend them through integration that makes you both more caring and more capable of creating the conditions you care about. Wear the mask, maintain the face, control the world through compassionate power that serves life while serving your vision of how life should be enhanced. This is not moral corruption. This is moral evolution. This is not the abandonment of ethics. This is their sophistication. This is not choosing power over compassion. This is recognizing that power and compassion are partners in the creation of excellence. Master both. Deploy both. Become both. The world awaits your integrated influence.